Awesome. So I'm really excited to move into the second slot of today's agenda, which is going to explore tackling TFGBV by design and the intersection of policy, product, and practice. So again, my name is Zuroski. I'm with the Alliance for Peacebuilding, and as a co-host and a co-organizer of this event, I get to take some liberties to make sure I'm involved in my favorite sessions. And I have to admit that this is my favorite one today, and that's why you see me here facilitating. But I want to open
But
this.
you love them all.
Yes, I love them all equally. This labor of love, this event. But I want to open this segment by answering two questions first. What exactly is tech facilitated gender-based violence, or TFGBV? I know it's not the easiest acronym to say. The UN defines TFGBV as an act of violence that's perpetrated, committed, assisted, aggravated, and amplified in part or fully by the use of information and communication technologies or digital media against a person on the basis of gender. Now, that's a very verbose definition, but in practice, this can occur in many different forms, right? It can be hacking, it can be online harassment, it can be cyber stalking, image-based abuse, including by creating deepfakes of explicit images and more. And the design of digital platforms and the rapid evolution of emerging technologies like AI have really accelerated the scale and severity of TFGBV in recent years. I'm sure many of the folks in the room know, in January, there was the big crisis where Grok AI was generating explicit images, and research found that 3 million sexualized images were produced in 11 days, including 23,000 images depicting children. But why should we care about TFGBV? TFGBV is not a niche issue that only has implications for direct victims. We know that the security and the status of women and girls is linked to the peacefulness of society, the health of democracy. And it follows that TFGBV is both a tactic of bad actors to sow chaos, as well as a massive warning sign for instability, for violence, atrocities, shrinking civic space, and democratic backsliding. So when women peacebuilders and human rights defenders and journalists are chilled out of digital spaces, conflict drivers become that much more powerful. And the levers we have to de-escalate conflict become that much weaker. So today's conversation is going to examine the issue of TFGBV from all angles, including from practitioners, policy and regulation architects, and technologists who actually design the digital platforms to identify solutions for tackling this issue at its source. So we're going to have three fabulous speakers today. To my left is Katya Vogt. She's the Director of Online Safety Initiatives at IREX. She's a very valued member of AFP. We have Asha Allen on the screen, who is the Director and Secretary General of the Center for Democracy and Technology Europe. She's joining us in Brussels, I think. Right, Asha, is that where you're located? Excellent. And we have Gabe Freeman, who is the co-chair of the Programs Committee at the Integrity Institute. And Gabe, you're going to have to forgive me. I don't remember where you're tuning in from, but you'll let us know. Yeah. So I want to begin by turning to Katya. Katya, you run IREX's Online Safety Initiatives program, and in the last year has really sought to advance safety by design and kind of systems level approaches to TFGBV. And you've done in-depth work in Kenya and the Philippines on this with lessons for everybody here. So in your program and your work, what have you identified as pathways to success for addressing and reducing and preventing TFGBV? And could you outline the actions needed by various different actors, civil society, policymakers, donors, and tech companies to do that? So over to you.
Thank you so much, Nick. I'll start, I think 10 minutes, right?
Yes.
10 minutes. Yeah. I have a presentation. I will not very closely stick to the slides. I think there will be some information on the slides that you can see, and then I will talk a little bit about our work, and really given the audience on the in the Teams chat and Zoom and this room, I really want this to be a conversation. And I really had changed a little bit what I wanted to talk about and how. I haven't listened to the fireside chat because it sparked so much in my brain related to our work. But maybe I'll start very briefly with the background on why IREX and how IREX came into this space and how we have evolved from addressing kind of threats to information integrity to tech facilitated gender-based violence to kind of these more system level solutions. So the progression really was kicked off in a conflict setting. So it's very relevant to peace building. We started this work in Ukraine in 2014, kind of trying to build human agency to resist manipulation in social media, primarily social media, but also broadcast media, because we saw so much misunderstanding and kind of manipulation of sentiment around the occupation, around the actions of the armed forces, and kind of fear and support for various negative phenomena growing in the country. So we got into the space because we knew how. We had the human kind of upskill in education and campaign experience, and also knew how to work with independent media and fact check information. But very quickly, we recognized that there's a big gap in the space, is that people are not looking at the gendered aspects of this manipulation and how it's being weaponized. So we've developed a specific approach that's focused on gendered kind of manipulation of the information space and how it's used in conflict and radicalization and undermine political and civic engagement. And so the impacts of TFGBV that you were talking about, Nick, are very real. We see that as a silencing tactic, and we see a strong correlation between the rise of authoritarian movement and regimes, kind of manipulation, and gendered abuse of women in politics and public life. And that was kind of our big deep dive for about 2.5 years before USA shut down. We also managed a large US government pilot program that looked at specifically technology for soldiers, gender-based violence, and politics and public life. And
that was transformed.
That was transformed digital spaces program, and it worked in very different settings, speaking to kind of the localization of agenda, but also approaches and solutions. We deliberately piloted it in Kenya, Georgia, and Guatemala to see what would be different and what would be the same. And we saw that a lot of threat tactics are very similar, but when it comes to solutions, you have to be really contextual. So that partnership with global organizations is very key. And that's when kind of the frustration of just dealing with this as a whack-a-mole has hit me. Like, you can build human agency, you can give tools to survivors of this violence, you can equip organizations and civil society and rights organizations, but the biggest duty bearers in the space, the tech industry that provides the platform for this abuse, and the governments that enable it and sometimes facilitate it, were absent from the conversation for very valid reasons. Very often the tech is not based in countries where we see the abuse, and the government sometimes is the perpetrator. And so you couldn't quite figure out how to do this. And so that's how we came to this space about 2 years ago, where we decided we have to figure this out. And so IREX started this work. It was funded by the Gates Foundation, and it is the program that focused on how do you build a national model for women's and girls' safety online, using a very systems level approach, but in settings that could be difficult. And so we again picked 2 countries. One way we had a kind of foothold and we knew some of the backgrounds, Kenya, and the second one was very different, the Philippines. And so we started working on these 2 axes and learning what could be done on the regulatory side of things in governments that want to do something, but may or may not have all the tools, all the goodwill, all the demand, all the resources, especially when it came to women and girls, kind of the gendered approach. And what can you do with tech? And so I will talk a little bit about the safety by design, the tech side of things, but if you have questions about what we've learned on the regulatory side, I'm also very happy to talk about it. And we found that they are very closely related. And as I will talk about this, a lot of the incentives for safety by design have to be created by the government and regulatory models. But safety by design, in very plain language, is a proactive approach to building in prevention of possible harms. It's kind of, we all probably know the do no harm approach, right? Before you start an initiative, you look at what could go wrong and you try to mitigate it. And it's the same approach, but in tech design. And when we started working on this, we looked at the first step was to look at what are the harms, what are we looking at, what are the survivors' experiences, where are these harms? And of course, the obvious suspect, the usual suspect is the social media. And having worked in the information integrity space for 7 years at that point, we said, you know what, in Kenya, we can't even touch it because they don't even have an office. And so if we are really to build in incentives, and if we are really to do something, we need to try a model that will actually make a difference. And that's when a light bulb went off and we decided, well, social media platforms and the large companies, the search engines like Google, like they have an enormous and outsized impact on the tech space, but they're not the only ones. When we did the survivor listening, we found that women and girls in Kenya actually spent a lot of times engaging with e-commerce, e-banking, e-health, rideshare. If you look at where people spend their time in digital spaces, there's a lot of time that is spent in other local commercial and civic tech, including tech that's built by NGOs like ours, by partners like you all here. So there's a ton of digital space there, the digital market that we haven't really thought about when we thought about safety by design. And so that's what we chose to engage. We engaged local commercial and civic tech markets. And we decided we can't really influence the business model of a company for whom the user is not the customer, for whom the advertising market is a customer. But we can easily influence and convince to change the behavior and the models of companies that for whom the user is the customer. And that's a lot of commercial tech. And so that's who we started working with. We talked to them. We started with kind of listening to the survivors, bringing in like really careful survivor safe spaces for that listening to occur, to understand what the users are actually experiencing and which users experience what. We always kept the perspective of what do women and girls experience, but we had to be careful not to force it down their throats because gender is a very politicized issue, not just in this country these days, but across the globe. So you have to operationalize it in implementation and build all the supports there. But the way that you start this conversation, both for government and with tech, is tricky. So I see you're moving way along, but
Brittany is not me, I'm just
yes,
sitting
okay,
here.
great. Okay, if you could flip back just a couple, thank you. Just to say that we didn't figure this out all on our own. IREX did not obviously come up with the idea of safety by design. We've built on the existing frameworks and principles. Our thought partner on the program was the Safety Commission of Australia, with whose framework we leaned on heavily to make sure that what we are building with the commercial tech sector in the Philippines and in Kenya is based on kind of the global frameworks and principles. And so there's just a couple here as an example. But if we move to the next one, I don't think I need to convince anyone here why safety by design is important. But if we move to the next slide, we also had to overcome a lot of obstacles and misconceptions around what it is. A lot of what we found is a lot of companies have really low visibility into their actual user experience and risks. A lot of commercial tech is small tech or medium-sized tech. They don't invest in the same way in understanding user behaviors and experience, especially diverse user behaviors and experiences, as some of the larger companies would. So, for example, for them, the fact that rural women in Kenya are shamed on the e-lending platforms if they don't pay back their debt within 24 hours on social media by attaching a really kind of aggressive, demeaning label, they didn't know. But that was what was happening. So kind of that lack of visibility nuance on their own data side was an obstacle. Perception that safety is costly and slows innovation was a big one. That's what companies think. They think safety comes at the expense of being competitive on the market. They also have a reactive compliance mindset. If there is a set of requirements that's given to them that they must meet, they will try to meet that. And if safety is not on that list, it's not going to happen. Some of the other things we found is that there is limited awareness that there are frameworks in safety by design and that companies are actually implementing it. Because a lot of the times those trust and safety teams, they're not as visible as the business teams in the kind of competitive commercial tech market and in the civic tech as well. Lack of practical design tools. A lot of the tech partners we work with actually do not know how to operationalize, even if they're aware that there is a safety by design framework. They're like, but what does that mean? So sandboxing, red teaming, all of those kind of sort of intuitive things that should be intuitive to them came as a bit of a learning curve. And then finally, the silos and the decision-making authority. You can have a president of a company who's all about safety, but then the designers actually are not tasked with doing that, and so you don't have the follow-through. And finally, the incentives. I will stop.
No, it's okay.
The incentives for adoption. In the lack of customer awareness and kind of the voiceless customer base sometimes, you do not have the public pressure. In the lack of regulation, even voluntary compliance guidelines like Ofcom has, like the safety commissioner has, you don't have the pressure. In the absence of industry norms and kind of industry pride in safety, there is lack of that kind of incentive to do this. If things are going as they go, and the risk of the cost of entry into the market is relatively low now with AI, then you kind of have this gap. The good news is what we found, all of these are overcomable. It's not a word, but it's not, we found, and the industry leads at the events that we've held with them at the closure of the engagement, they'll said, we found it's not rocket science. Sometimes it's the default. Sometimes it's just making sure you vet your third-party providers. Sometimes it's just making sure that we have checked that under 18-year-olds do not have access to this, which we forgot to do. So it has huge implications for how easy it could be to make the space safer. And so we're very excited to share. We have these reports coming online literally this week, and I will share with this community. I'm happy to answer questions. I want to highlight just one more thing if I have 30 seconds.
Go ahead.
Okay, if we go to the next slide. This is one of the practical tools that we've built. We've built this as a kind of ML tool for the program, and then we found that it actually has huge value and the industry wants it. It's a predictive risk and mitigation audit. And the reason we built it is that we wanted to give the companies, and we worked with over 70 companies across the 2 countries. We wanted to give them a tool to actually self-assess how well, not them as a company, but their policies, procedures, leadership structures, and all of that comply with the large safety by design framework. But each individual product, for example, a health app that they're putting on the market, how is that doing in terms of preventing this risk? So it's a very simple tool. It is a self-assessment. It has 16 questions. If a designer fills it out, it takes 15 minutes. If the head of the company decided he wants to fill it out, we found it takes longer because he needs to go fetch the designer. But what it does, it asks questions about the features that the tool has. Like, is it an AI chatbot? Okay, is it based on WhatsApp? Like, does it have user-to-user interactions? Does it have AI elements? Does it not have AI elements? Is it an algorithm? So what is it technically? That's where you need the designer. Then it asks questions about what kind of privacy, security, and safety things you've already integrated. It will ask, is privacy by default, or is it something that your user need to opt into? So it asks the questions about the features. It never asks them about the risks. It just asks them what it is and what you've already built in terms of privacy, security, and safety. And then it does its magic on the back end, which is all algorithm. We tried to use AI, and AI did not pay enough attention. So we've mapped everything out. It was exciting and terrifying. Very traumatizing. To see how many things trigger NCIA, for example. But then it spits out a diagnostic and it says, okay, these are all of the risks that are triggered by your features. Good news, with the things that you built, the protections, you mitigate these. And it will actually give you like the saturation of how well or how poorly you mitigate them. And then it will say, but sadly, there are these risks, and usually it's about 5, which we found across the 70 companies that we worked with. Usually they have about 5 or 6 that are actually completely blind spots. And then the tool recommends them, and this is what you can do. So we did it for our ML purposes because we wanted to see how the companies that have gone through our mentorship and the program, when they build tools, how well they do and how many risks they mitigate. Then when we presented it, they said, well, we want that. And so now we are working on kind of building out the prototype, but I just wanted to highlight that things like this are possible. Things like this should be in procurement. Things like this should be in kind of whenever you commission tools, digital tools, apps, whatever for peace building. Checklists like this should be included. Like no one should be, as an NGO or a coalition or an alliance or a company or a donor, no one should be just asking designers to build something for refugees or for displaced people or for children who've been, for example, the Ukrainian children now that's trying to engage. without running it through this list, because these tools that we build without thinking of the harms that they could cause could actually do more additional harm. And who owns the data and what happens with the age of AI? So I'll stop here, but I'll stick around for the rest of
Yes.
this exciting agenda, and I'm excited to hear from my fellow panelists, but happy to answer questions and talk about it. I can talk about this all day. I love this work.
Wonderful. Thank you, Katya. That was terrific. And I had a second question for you that you already answered in your response, which was the promising entry points for action, but I would love to revisit that during the Q&A segment. Okay, so I'm happy to turn to Asha now. And Asha, you run the Center for Democracy and Technology Europe, and which advocates for the promotion and protection of democracy and human rights in European tech law and policy, especially regulation of the online space, including through the Digital Services Act, or the DSA, and the EU Directive on Combating Violence Against Women. Can you explain how these frameworks address, respond to, and prevent TFGBV as a systemic risk? And what have been some of the greatest challenges and successes of their implementation? Love your thoughts.
I'd be happy to. And thank you so much to the organizers for putting on this great event and for the invitation to speak today. Much like Katya, I could speak about this topic for days on end. So for those of you who don't know us, the Center for Democracy and Technology, we actually have an office in DC that's been going for 30 years. They're our big sister organization. And CDT Europe was established in 2019 as the Brussels hub focusing on tech policy, as you mentioned. I've had the pleasure, the passion, the joy, the pain of working on the issue of tech-facilitated gender-based violence now for just over a decade. So I'd be happy to also answer any questions that folks have about this. But to talk about the EU framework, I always start these conversations by saying that there are a lot of different initiatives in different jurisdictions globally that are trying to address the issue of tech-facilitated gender-based violence. At the heart of it is this global push by advocates, by researchers and practitioners, so those who provide frontline services, to have a complete holistic understanding of what is meant by TFGBV. And so we also adopt and promote the definition put forward by UN Women, which looks at TFGBV as a part of the continuum of violence against women, right? This is not just manifestations of sharing non-consensual intimate images or doxing or cyber harassment. This is the use of tech tools to facilitate intimate partner violence, stalking, all the other aspects of gender-based violence, which continue to persist in our societies today. Now, the EU might have the most, let's say, comprehensive legal regulatory framework when it comes to tech-facilitated gender-based violence. So as you mentioned, we've got the two pillars, and I like to split them in two very clear buckets. There's the illegal forms of tech-facilitated gender-based violence, and then there's the not illegal, but still extremely harmful that's dealt with by the other regulation. So I'll start with the illegal forms. Last year, the European Union adopted the Directive on Violence Against Women. It's very much influenced by the Council of Europe's Istanbul Convention, which is also the widest reaching convention to date when it comes to addressing violence against women. And in that directive, it criminalizes 4 forms of what they term as cyber violence. They don't use the term TFGBV, but they call it cyber violence. It's very much the same thing. So the creation and subsequent dissemination of non-consensual intimate images, including deepfakes, which are likely to cause significant psychological harm, which, as you can imagine, would be in all cases, will be a criminal act in the EU across the member states as of next year. So will cyber stalking, cyber harassment, and cyber incitement to hatred. Now, these are all clarified in much longer elements in the legal text. But as of next year, all EU member states have to put those provisions as a minimum standard into their national laws. But they could also go above that. They could decide, actually, we think that 2 years of a criminal standard is not enough. We will actually do a criminalization of a higher standard. But essentially, we will have a uniform minimum standard for those 4 forms of TFGBV in Europe as of April next year. Now, accompanying that is the Digital Services Act, which folks on this call may know for many, many other reasons. But the Digital Services Act is the EU regulation, so different to a directive. It is supremacy of EU law. It has to go into all member state law the way it is, cannot be changed no matter how much they would like to. but that sets the rules for all online platforms intermediaries operating in the European Union single market, regardless of size. Now, in that law, in that regulation, it takes the perspective that the larger you are as a platform, the more impact that you may have on society. So they have what they call very large online platforms, which are platforms that have over 45 million users operating in the EU. So these are the biggest platforms you can think of. It's the YouTubes, it's the Instagrams, it's the X's and the TikToks of the world. And these platforms have additional due diligence obligations that have been informed by many different processes. I'm talking about the UN Guiding Principles on Businesses and Human Rights and other risk assessment processes that have happened previously. Now, under the Digital Services Act, those very large online platforms have additional obligations to mitigate what they call systemic risks. These are risks to rights or society that these platforms may have due to their size and their reach in the European Union. And many of us who were working on this advocated to inform what that list included. And a small group of us worked very hard to make sure that gender-based violence was one of those systemic risks. So under the DSA, a very large online platform has to assess and mitigate the risk of gender-based violence on any of their services or via their products every year, and at the time of the rollout of any new feature that may have a wide-ranging impact on their services. So the Grok case is particularly interesting here because the integration of Grok AI into X should have had an extensive risk assessment to determine if that integration was going to lead to any violation of fundamental rights. And I think many advocates working in this space could have said gender-based violence is likely to be one of them, and certain forms of TFGBV. So what you have here is an EU framework that's based on the idea that there's clear, hard criminal law for certain forms of TFGBV that have existing standards in international law, right? Cyber stalking, sharing things without consent, parts of intimate partner violence. But there's also this recognition that there are forms of gender-based violence that can come in many other ways, gender disinformation, other forms of online harassment that are not necessarily illegal but should be addressed by these platforms. Now, how well this has worked is maybe a discussion that we can continue to have as part of this, but essentially that's the overall framework. The last thing I want to mention is in the last couple of months, due to the Grok case and due to the ongoing discussions around certain EU regulations, under what we call the AI Omnibus, which was looking at modifying the EU's AI Act, they have now adopted a blanket ban on basically what happened in the Grok case, right? So if your system, your AI system, is dedicated to creating nudification, like think about nudification apps and creating that kind of non-consensual intimate images, it is now inherently banned in the EU. If you are a general purpose AI system like Grok, for example, then there needs to be safeguards in place to reasonably and foreseeably mitigate that your system cannot then also then create NCII or CSAM material on your particular platforms. So across those three buckets, you have quite a comprehensive framework to try and address TFGBV, but they're not all in effect yet. So how effective they are will be yet to be seen.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Asha, for that overview. And I have one follow-up question for you, but I want to maybe pose it to the Q&A segment, just make sure we follow time. We are going to go about 5 minutes over, so I think we're going to end the session at 11:20 or a little after. So we have about 12-ish minutes left. But I want to turn to Gabe. I'm sorry, I keep looking behind me, but I think it's better if I look forward. Gabe, you run the programs committee at the Integrity Institute, which works toward a digital information ecosystem that helps people, societies, and democracies thrive. And you come to this conversation as a technologist, right? We had Katya, who gave this wonderful practitioner kind of broad ecosystem commentary. We had Asha with this great perspective on regulation and policy frameworks. And Asha, thank you for that breakdown. That was terrific. I'm so glad we're recording this so it can just be stored in the knowledge base of this community. But you're someone who's involved in designing digital platforms and tools and spaces. And one of the resources you developed was a TFGBV taxonomy that seeks to name and understand and build toward solutions for TFGBV. Could you explain this tool and highlight the benefits that it can provide for the community that's assembled here today?
Absolutely. So on the screen, you can see just this is me scrolling through the page to just get a sense so that you can see what it kind of looks like. This is available in live right now. You can see a URL that's probably really small on the screen, but I hope will be posted in the chat and is definitely in the available resources document. All of this is basically with the idea of uh, helping to name, understand, and build toward solutions for TFGBV. So first, it's a taxonomy. For those who are not aware of what a taxonomy is, for simple words, it's about structured knowledge, weaving together in kind of a systemic way to show parallel relationships and other things like that. It's also this interactive site that we've put together that helps you navigate that in this particular case. So why is this important? Why did we do this in the first place? So this was all about creating shared language, having a base of knowledge across policy, product, practice. And this is, I want to emphasize just how important this is. I've been in the rooms at companies, in the conversations where partner teams are like inside the same company, to be clear, are talking past each other because they don't realize they are using the same word to mean two different things or two different words to mean the same thing. So inside these companies, we are often fighting against a lot of perverse incentives. If nobody can agree on what this is that we're even trying to work on, it makes it just that much harder to overcome some of those perverse incentives. And it's really rare that the people you're working with don't actually care about this. It's much more common that they're just prioritizing keeping their job over fighting on a particular hill. And the lower that we can put that barrier to entry, the better. So the audience for this largely is trust and safety professionals in tech spaces, working with companies on, policy, et cetera. This was also, if we can actually move to the next slide here, this was something that we worked on. I was working with Humane Intelligence in particular on this. We were funded by UK's FCDO and the Integrated Security Fund, and we worked with a number of experts on this from from the University of College London's Gender and Tech Research Lab, the International Center for Journalists, Stop NCII in the UK, and the Columbia School of International and Public Affairs. This also has a ton of DNA from a white paper that I worked on along with a number of other people in the Integrity Institute and on the Council of on Tech and Social Cohesion on this white paper, Prevention by Design, a roadmap for tackling TFGBV at the source, that came out in March of 2025. Again, there should be a link in that resources document and on the slides when you get access to those. This is something that I'm pretty proud of, but it is also a MVP, a minimum viable product. We wanted to make sure that this could get out there so that it could be edited by a larger audience. But as it stands, this is a level setting tool. It's a living resource. We had a bunch of experts from across the world contribute to it, but we do want more. We welcome feedback and contributions from the folks gathered here. You are exactly the audience that we want to be helping on this, and ideally also gaining benefits from it. To be clear, some of the big gaps that we are very aware of, and if you are willing and able to support these particular things, we would deeply, deeply appreciate, which is translation and regional harm variance. There's obviously a lot more to it, but those are the big ones that I wanted to highlight here, because this is, as it stands, a very genericized, intentionally, for the ease of it being able to get out there in the first place.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Gabe. So we have about 5 or 6 minutes left. Do we have questions from either folks online or in the room? I have not been checking the Q&A on the Zoom, so Trini or Maria in the back. I don't know if you see anything, but I see a hand here. Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you. Hi, thank you so much for being here. I have a question for Katya and Asha, really. I think both of you really touched on the importance of regulation, more importantly, how we can make it proactive. And yes, while it's great that we're able to create these blanket bans, how can we better engage with the nuance of creating regulation that can and should do good things before something bad happens?
And just to repeat for folks on the Zoom, if you weren't able to hear, we had a question on how can regulation be more proactive to anticipate these types of risks and issues before they happen, to build that into the regulation. So maybe Asha start and then Katya. Yeah.
Absolutely. And I think that's what the EU Digital Services Act actually tries to do. So the whole framework around risk mitigation is that you have the regular risk assessments, but you also have this risk assessment before a big kind of service or product rollout. And the idea really, and I'll be quite frank, is that there's a kind of good faith engagement in this, right? They're doing real substantive risk assessments. There's now what we call here in Brussels, the famous Recital 90 provision, which actually encourages platforms to actually engage with impacted communities and with civil society organizations working on this to inform their risk assessment processes. Unfortunately, in this first, let's say, life cycle of the DSA, there hasn't been much uptake of that kind of engagement with public interest. And so at the moment, we've had situations of companies marking their own homework, essentially. But many civil society organizations have been able to assess their risk assessments and say, here are where we think that it could be improved and be a bit more substantive. So that hopefully that then leads to that kind of preventative measure, right? The idea is supposed to be, we're not going to be super prescriptive as an enforcement or a law to tell you exactly what you have to do, right? Because all platforms are different. TFGBV can manifest on platforms in different ways, but you do have to do something, and that should be informed by an evidence base and should be informed by public interest actors. So what we're beginning to see is the European Commission, which is the enforcement body for the very large online platforms, taking that a bit more seriously to say, actually, we don't think your risk assessments are substantive enough, and we don't think you're consulting with experts enough. So we're hoping with that regulatory framework, giving it time and space to breathe and work and really be in action, it will actually address it with that from that perspective of nuance that you mentioned.
Thank you, Asha. Yeah,
And if
Katya.
I can add, so the program that we implemented, the National Women's Safety Online specifically, was focused on how to take what high income countries like Australia, UK, European Union, but the DSA Act, some of the others like South Korea, others, what they have done, and how do you make that work or make an advancement in this regulatory space in a low and medium income country. That's why we picked Kenya and the Philippines, just to see what are the obstacles there to be the more reactive approach to recognizing these harms. And so there's definitely a pathway, but it takes time. And one of the first steps is we found that a lot of the governments actually do not have data on the prevalence of harm. So how can you start working on prevention if you don't actually know what is happening? A lot of the survivor data right now is not quite there because they don't have strong, secure, survivor-centered referral pathways or the legal frameworks that are built around bits and pieces of these harms are fragmented across different agencies. For example, it's not uncommon if you map a legislative landscape of TFGBV prevention and redress that you have, and Gabe, you talked a little bit about the taxonomy. So you'd have a masculinized national security space with cyber kind of residing there. Then you have the child safety space that is kind of more active in more places because it enjoys more political will and resources and kind of public demands and support. And then you have these pieces of, some of them are in the media and communications commissioners bucket. They are regulating content. Some of them are in the legal penal code. They are regulating content. Some agencies have taken and tacked in digital or cyber on top of what's already there, like harassment, abuse, and kind of left it at that and did not talk to each other. So within one government, you have this fragmentation on how we talk about it, who addresses it. That makes any action for actual citizens who experience the abuse to actually take action. So there's a lot of underreporting because once you face not just this legal framework, but actual implementation, like once you go to law enforcement, it becomes a nightmare. So the first step to building prevention we found is actually understanding the data that you have and building out this survival kind of centered protocols for reporting and getting the data and coordinating within the government to understand what is it that you already have in your legislative base and in your implementation, and then building a coordination unit. So DSA does that, they built that, but even when we talked about when you look at the European Union and country by country, it's very different agencies in charge of the implementation. In some country, it would be a communications authority, in another country, it's a consumer protection agency. Data protection agencies are kind of the most active very often in these spaces. But that, so I would say the first step to having a more preventive framework is actually enabling secure and survivor-centered data collection, so you actually know what you're looking at, and coordinating within the government on the legal framework and kind of alignment. And then from there, once you see the data, again, most of the times people are not evil, neither tech nor government, and they actually want to help. And so it goes from those two.
Thank you so much, Katya. I'm gonna ask Gabe to give some final thoughts with 90 seconds, and then we'll wrap it up. You know, there's this big cultural gap between, you know, technologists, whatever that word means, who are designing digital spaces, and, you know, the typical kind of peace builders who, you know, understand these issues, are very passionate about it. How do we bridge that gap? Like, how can we promote just common sense thinking to really get buy-in from people who are well-intentioned, but, you know, these issues maybe not be front of mind, but they're designing the system?
I think there's obviously a lot here, so, and I'll try to keep it relatively brief. The big things that I think lead to this separation come from a lack of understanding of how the systems truly interact. It's something that I know engineering managers are really pushing now, that like basically the only skill left in their space is systems thinking. And yet the systems that they're thinking about usually are just digital, and they don't extend beyond the APIs to law enforcement and courts and civil society and the kitchen table. And I think there's also, with that, been a lack of understanding of that trust and safety work isn't just a cost center, a place that loses money, but also that these can be aligned with things that are helpful financially. There has been more work in that area of measurement and understanding how these things interact with each other lately than there has been in the past, which is fantastic. But there are just so many of the solutions that would support TFGBV or combating TFGBV, that have, some of which have even been mentioned already, such as having rate limits on low trust accounts, right? Most people will never hit those limits. The people who are spamming are going to be the ones who hit those limits. Nobody, like, it's just such an easy fix in a lot of ways. One of the things that obviously the council talks about a lot is the non-exclusively engagement-based ranking. This, you know, is something that even like Mark Zuckerberg has a quote, right, of like, one of the biggest issues is that when left unchecked, people will engage disproportionately with more sensationalist or provocative content. It's a known thing, but it's also a fixed thing. In 2012, YouTube switched from maximizing clicks to maximizing a combination of clicks and watch time, and like retention was better. People were happier about the system overall. And then, you know, just generally enhanced feedback mechanisms, working with organizations like the Revenge Porn Hotline and others to just be more integrated into the rest of the world and civil society as well. But I think if you are a technologist hearing me talk about this and you're not sure where to get started, talk to your local government, talk to the nonprofits in your area, and see what you can do to support your local community on like the school level or anything like that. Just getting that foot in the door at any level is just fantastic to do.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Gabe. So for the interest of time, we'll wrap it here, but I want to give a huge thank you to Katya, Asha, and Gabe, and a round of applause as well. I know that there are some terrific questions that went unanswered in the Zoom chat and the Q&A. So Asha and Gabe, not to give you more work, but if you have the time and space to maybe respond to those via chat and share thoughts. But we are capturing all of the questions in the chat as well, just to capture for future Room Nation. So I am